Podcasts on UNC-TV.org are made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC-TV.
One day in Chapel Hill, 8-year-old Rebecca Burke is struck by lightning, and things are never the same for her. And sometimes lightning does strike twice, as it does in Michele Youngstone's new novel, The Handbook for Lightning Strike Survivors. We'll get her to talk to us about lightning strikes, about her new book, and about some of the real risk involved in lightning on North Carolina Bookwatch. Next.
Funding for North Carolina Bookwatch is made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC-TV, and by the Mary Duke Biddle Foundation, Quail Ridge Books and Music, and the North Carolina Humanities Council.
Welcome to North Carolina Bookwatch. I'm D.G. Martin, and my guest is Michele Youngstone, the author of The Handbook for Lightning Strike Survivors.
Hi.
Hey, welcome, Michele.
Thanks. Thanks for having me.
Well, a little bit unusual. You live in Richmond and grew up in Richmond.
I did.
But your book is largely set in North Carolina, both in the Piedmont and on the coast. And your book is about lightning strike survivors. It's fiction, but there's some real stuff happening, including that you got struck by lightning. How did your experience lead to the book?
Well, honestly, when I set out, I always knew I wanted to be a novelist since second grade. And when I set out to write the novel, I wanted to write a book about a girl's dysfunctional relationship with her father and how she would try in her life to somehow fill that hole, that gap that she felt from not having his love. And so this was a very small little beginning seedling, and one of my professors said to me, do you know how many books there are about girls who have dysfunctional fathers? It's kind of cliche, or have dysfunctional relationships with their dads. It's so cliche. He said, what can you do to make your book a little different?
He didn't say don't do it. He just said it's got to be, you got to have an angle.
Right. He said, do you want to sell your book? Because if you want your book to sell, you need something that's going to make it pop, that's going to set it apart from everything else. You need like a shock factor, pun intended. And I was struck by lightning when I was 11 in Chester, Virginia. And so that gave me the idea to have my main character struck by lightning. And on that note, I got to thinking, too, that I love magical realism. And when you're a kid, I think all kids think they have magic powers. I mean, they think they're indestructible. And so in Becca's case, she feels even more indestructible because she was struck by lightning and she survived. And she doesn't know exactly what that means for her for the rest of her life.
So your main character, lots of characters, but yeah. Becca, the young woman that we said earlier was struck by lightning when she was 8 years old in Chapel Hill. Mm-hmm. This became the signal experience for her in her life. And you mentioned that you started out to have concentrate on the relationship between this girl and her good-for-nothing father.
Yes, her philandering father.
But it starts out, would you tell us the scene about Becca gets struck by lightning, and then her father must hug her and kiss her and say, oh, I'm sorry, let's go to the hospital? What happened?
No, her dad is more like she comes in and her knee's bloody and she's been knocked down and traumatized and she's in shock, which is what happens when you're struck by lightning. And she walks into the den and he's reading like Yachting Today because he's in love with all things that have to do with having money, and he wants to get his own sailing vessel. And she's like, Dad, I got struck by lightning. And I don't think he even looks up from the magazine at first. He just says, honey, if you were struck by lightning, you'd be dead. And so she goes upstairs to get cleaned up because he's supposed to take her to get ice cream at Sutton's Drugstore right here in Chapel Hill, which he ends up not taking her. But
So this gives us a clue about the relationship between the little girl and her father. And how your teacher said, watch out if it's just about a dysfunctional relationship between a little girl and her dad, it's not going to go very far. How did you move it from the lightning strike on through?
You know, I have really no idea. As I wrote the book, I read about writers, like one of my favorite writers is John Irving, and apparently he always knows how a book will end when he starts it. He doesn't know how he's going to get there, but he knows the ending.
Knows the last sentence.
Yeah.
As he starts his book.
When I start a book, I don't know where it's going or what's going to happen. And on that note, there's a second main character, Buckley, Pie Tank, and the book became it's so much more than a book about a girl's relationship with her dad. And it partly was because Buckley, when I was writing, just showed up one day on the page. He's poor. He lives in Arkansas. He's got an overweight mother and a grandmother who doesn't have a lot of love in her heart for him. And I thought, what the hell are you people doing here? You can't be in my book. You're ruining it. But whenever that happens to me and people show up and I don't know why, I know it's really, really good because they want to be there and they start to take over. So then I just kept writing to try and see how Buckley is related to Becca, these two people who have nothing in common. And from there, that's...
All right, a couple of things that they don't have in common. Buckley lives in Arkansas,
right,
at least to start with, and Becca is living in North Carolina in Chapel Hill. They know nothing of each other, at least at the beginning. So how do you, well, tell us a little bit about Buckley and then how you get him connected to Becca.
Well, I wasn't sure when I was writing it how he was connected to Becca, but then I started to realize that we're connected to so many people ourselves in our lives that we're not aware of. Like how you and I were talking before about we know some of the same people, but know them, I guess, like that 6 degrees of separation. But because, too, this book ended up, it is about dysfunctional family and how if our family isn't the family that we want, because we can't choose who we're born to, we don't decide our parents, how do we make our way in the world? Who do we decide and choose to make connections with? And are those people connected to other people we might know? And throughout the novel, I came to realize as I was writing it that Becca and Buckley are connected in multiple ways. And as you read the book, part of the suspense factor is finding out how they're connected. They both are affected by lightning, which is something that, like too many things in our lives, we can't control lightning. We don't have any way to stop it or control it. It's
well, let me push you a little bit. One of I mean, we've got a book here that's titled The Handbook for Lightning Strike Survivors, which sounds like a nonfiction book, but it's actually a novel. And so just what I found interesting was that Buckley came to write a nonfiction book, I mean a pamphlet or something. And the connective link was that he loved his mother so much, or you made him love his mother so much, and then had her struck by lightning. So he's not been struck by lightning exactly, but lightning has destroyed his life.
And he, like so many of us do, he blames himself somewhat for his mother's death.
How can you do that? How can you blame yourself for somebody else getting struck by lightning?
Well, in the novel, he made them late to the dock. Had they gotten, in his mind, he runs these things over and over. If he had been nicer to Tide, another character, if he had been nicer to Patty John, it's the first time Buckley is such a, he's kind of a sad little boy and a loner, and he doesn't really have any friends. And because when he's in Galveston, Texas, where his mother is struck, this is the first time in his life where things are going really good for him. And he starts to loosen up a little bit and like himself. And he's got a girlfriend named Flamehead. And, he's got it going on. He's got cool clothes and his hair's looking good. And he's finally feeling confident. And so I think he thinks because he allowed himself to be happy, his mother paid the price. And I think we think things like that, even though they're not rational. These are the kinds of things we think. Like, if I had been better to my mother, this wouldn't have happened. If we had gotten there on time, if you know, it should have been me, it shouldn't have been her. And because she doesn't survive, he eventually comes to write this handbook for those who do survive and to educate people on lightning.
Well, what did, let's take a diversion just for a moment. What did Buckley, who's now gotten to be an expert on lightning,
Sort of.
And you deliver to us in your novel some of the parts of the book that he wrote. So it really is included a handbook for lightning strike survivors. Well, I was under the impression that when you got struck by lightning, you were dead. What's the real story?
Yeah, 90%, and the book opens with this, 90% of people struck by lightning survive. 90% of people are survivors, and largely what that's dependent upon is what kind of lightning, where you were struck by lightning, and if people begin CPR. Just recently there was a story in Asheville, North Carolina about a woman from Knoxville, Tennessee, who was hiking on a mountain with her boyfriend a couple weeks ago, and he was planning to propose to her, and there was this huge electrical storm, and they were both struck, but he was still conscious. He had burns from where the water was on his skin and the lightning, and he did the exact right thing, which is what the novel tells you to do. Treat the apparently dead first. His girlfriend, her heart had stopped beating because the electrical shock will stop your heart. But if you begin CPR immediately, you can often save people because you get their heart started. And he kept trying to call on the cell phone, but where they were, there was no coverage. The lightning kept coming down. So he was doing CPR. He was doing everything that he could do. But then eventually he had to leave and go try to get help. And they had EMS workers and the family that got the EMS out there. They all tried and tried to revive this young woman who was only 25, but to no avail. If EMS could have gotten to her sooner, she might have been able to live. But it's not true that most people who are struck die. It really just depends on how fast they get help. If you are struck directly in the head, as Buckley's mother is, and then the return charge goes, because lightning's sort of like a battery with a negative and positive charge, and it's that charge from the ground returning to the cloud that's the stronger charge, because it makes a connection.
Hit by lightning comes through you, and then
it has to connect back up.
But if it does, how do you keep it from going? What might keep it from there being a return charge?
Well, like in my case, we think the only reason that I lived was because when I was 11, I was getting into my dad's pickup truck, and it was a big old Ford or Chevy. He'll kill me for not knowing the difference. People have those weird truck allegiances, but anyway, I think what happened was because when I was struck, I had my hand on the truck door, that when it hit me, it knocked me off the truck down to the ground, and then the truck took the brunt force and returned back up to the cloud through the truck.
I loved the rule that developed, which is treat the apparently dead first. And is that because the lightning the electrical shock stops the heart, so people apparently are dead, but you can revive them if you'll go to work on them?
Right.
And what do you
exactly.
do? What's the right thing to do?
Administer CPR, breathe for them, pump their chest, get them going, call an ambulance, get some professionals there.
So 90% survive lightning strike.
10% do not.
In the case of your fictional character, Becca, she experiences some after effects, both a few physical and probably a number of psychological effects. How is she different from what she would have been? How did you make her different from what she would have been
Well, in photographs, she has halos around her head, as if you can see that her aura has changed and become visible under a photographic lens. For me personally, my head does appear like that in a lot of photographs from when I was younger, but you know, this is before digital cameras, so who's to say? I mean, you can believe that or you cannot believe that.
That is so interesting, the act, you know, this magic and the physical stuff. But I guess what I'm thinking about in your novel, Becca, who's been struck by lightning, and then has a troublesome relationship with her father, also has troublesome relationships with other men. She's sexually active, but not in a way that seems to provide fulfillment for her. And is this a result of the lightning strike or her relationship with her father, or is this just the way young women deal with men these days?
I think for Becca, all of the different being sexually promiscuous, she discovered was a way. If there's like a line in the book where there's this little boy, her first real sexual encounter with Irvin, Drinkwater, and she says something like, if only for a moment, you know, he loved her. It may have only been for that fleeting second of time, but he loved her, and she could control that. And so she knows that by making men feel good, and she can control it, that then they love her. And I don't think that has as much to do with the lightning as it does with her relationship with her father and wanting someone to love her. And then it's through her artwork that she finds another kind of love, a deeper love, and realizes that there's a scene when she's in New York where she just realizes that nothing, no man, no sexual encounter is going to fulfill her the way that she needs to be fulfilled.
By herself.
Right.
Well, speaking of the artistry, and you're an artist, you're a little bit of an artist too. You've had this experience, so the description of the art world comes across as being very real and in some respects very disturbing. One of the pieces of the book that I found very interesting, and although it's further along in your book, I think you can talk about it without it being critical to the book, and that is how Becca, as a young 19 or 20-year-old in New York as an artist, is exploited sexually by her art teacher, and then she turns the tables on it. And can you tell us how this happened and how she used her talents as an artist and how it was related to sort of, her earlier experiences?
Well, she has an affair with her professor, where I went to school in our MFA program, Master of Fine Arts. Promiscuity among students and professors is not that uncommon.
Is that right?
I don't know if it's like that here, but yeah, people that seems to happen.
Aren't there rules?
I think there are rules, but I think if you're over the age of 18, I don't know exactly what those rules are. But in this particular story, which is fictional, the professor is named Christopher Lord, but Becca refers to him as Apple Pie because he has such a clean-cut American face, and she calls his wife Mrs. Apple Pie. And she really likes him. Of all the men she's been with, she likes him the most. And I think it's because her father was a professor, and so she sees in Apple Pie what she, saw in her dad, which was a very definite self-assurance and confidence, and she thinks he's an artist. He's also, as her teacher and professor, someone who judges her artwork. And so in that regard, she wants his acceptance and praise. And so when he decides to break things off with her because she calls his house late at night and she stalks outside of his office, and he just doesn't want to deal with her. She's way too intense for him. So when he decides to break it off, she threatens him to go to Mrs. Apple Pie, and she's serious. She says, I'll do it. And so in exchange, she says, I won't do it, but I want you to bring one of your main buyers to see my artwork that they hang in the student gallery. And Apple Pie brings this man who does buy art and collect art, and who has a lot of money, and his name's Roderick Dweiser. So he brings him to see Becca's work. And he doesn't think that Roderick Dweiser will like her work because he considers it infantile and she's just an amateur. But she does turn the tables because it ends up that Roderick Dweiser loves her work. And there's a really, for me, touching scene where he offers to buy one of her paintings, and rather than selling it to him because he sees in it what she wants the audience to see in it, she gives it to him as a gift, which really irritates Apple Pie because he's very materialistic. And from there, Roderick Dweiser actually gets Becca in touch with a gallery in
becomes
Soho.
her sponsor, and
Yeah.
for at least momentarily for success. Now, what were the subjects of her? What were these paintings all about?
Oh gosh, I can't.
Well, I'm
even
thinking about
remember.
the fish number 14 and the.
Yeah, well, fish number 14 is where, because she has all of these memories from when she was in Nag's Head, and it's of lightning striking the ocean and all of these fish being littered and washed up on the beach. And it brings back to her mind when she actually saved a fish and she first started to believe in such things as miracles and believe that there was a higher power on earth, and to have faith. And as she's painting, what comes out in a lot of her artwork is not believing anymore. And so her paintings follow her spiritual journey throughout the book.
Well, it all works out in a way that is both surprising and interesting.
It's a page turner.
It is a page turner, and somehow or another, Buckley, your character who appeared suddenly and without being expected, comes into contact with Becca. And although you do not give us the assurance that they live happily ever after, they at least come to a conclusion that's satisfying. So anyway, that's a chore. Now, you said you didn't set out for that conclusion. But when you're not set out and you don't have a plan, how do you know when you come to a satisfying ending, or you just get tired of it and finish it up where it is? How does
You
that work?
definitely don't just get tired of it and finish it up. I spent months and months thinking about the ending, and someone said to me, because it could have been very tragic, or it could have been really uplifting and very Hollywood style. But someone actually said to me, I think your novel should reflect your own view of the world. What imprint do you want to leave on the world, on your reader? And that sort of helped me decide. And I thought about it and thought about it and thought about it. And then one day I just knew exactly how the book had to end. And I wrote it and rewrote it, and I had people read it and they felt electrified, and I knew that was it.
What you said it would reflect your sort of view of the world, and I mean, what is your view? I mean, what is this view of the world that your ending is consistent with?
I think that the book for me is about hope, and I call myself a glass half full kind of gal. I think that when all hope seems lost and maybe, everything seems like it's just as bad as it can be, I think you have to hang on. I think you have to hang in there and because there's always like a silver lining. I really believe that people have the ability to save other people. And I think that by doing things to make the world a better place, however small, makes a difference. I was a school teacher for 10 years, and I always had the motto that if I helped one student out of 120, I did something really great, because I made a difference in that one person's life, and they will, I know, make a difference in someone else's life. So,
well, real quickly, you've had the experience that many writers aspire to. You've done your training, you've turned it into a work that has been accepted by a major publisher, and you've
Yay!
had success. And what have you learned that you wish someone had told you a few years ago when you got started on this journey? What are the life lessons that you could pass on to some of the rest of us who would aspire to have the success that you've had?
When you think that you have an agent, don't pop that champagne until you're sure they're your agent. Rule number one.
Okay, that's a good rule. I hadn't heard that before. What are there agents who
oh my gosh,
pretend to represent you and don't?
Yeah, well, the stories run the gamut. Because you have to have an agent before you get a publisher. So you want a good agent from New York. And so you start off searching, and they'll tell you only write a letter to one agent at a time. Forget that, right? Send 10 out at a time. It takes forever. Years and years and years of rejection. So
be persistent. Hopeful and persistent.
Be hopeful and persistent. I had one woman call me up and say, "I love your book. It's wonderful. I really want to represent it. I'm 3/4 of the way through it, and I just think it's terrific." So my husband and I are like, "Yes, it's finally going to happen." So
but it didn't.
Pop the champagne, and the next day, she sends me an email and says, "I hated the last 3/4 of your novel."
Well, I wish we could talk more about that, and more about your book, and more about lightning striking. All of this is in your book. Michele Youngstone, thank you.
Thank you.
And we thank her for the wonderful book, The Handbook for Lightning Strike Survivors. Thank you for watching. If you'll come back here same time next week, I'll introduce you to the work of another one of our great writers.
Funding for North Carolina Bookwatch is made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC-TV, and by the Mary Duke Biddle Foundation, Quail Ridge Books and Music, and the North Carolina Humanities Council.
Podcasts on UNCTV.org are made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC-TV.